Miles Davis got into prestigious Juilliard, but told his teacher, "You can't teach me anything," and dropped out. What happened next changed music history forever. It was October 15th, 1944, and 18-year-old Miles Davis was sitting in his advanced music theory class at the Juilliard School of Music in New York City, the most prestigious musical institution in America. His professor, Dr. William Vacchiano, was explaining traditional European harmonic progressions with the confidence of someone who had taught the same curriculum for 30 years. But Miles was growing increasingly frustrated with what he saw as outdated, irrelevant instruction that had nothing to do with the music that was actually being created in the jazz clubs just 20 blocks away. When Professor Vacchiano dismissed Miles's question about incorporating blues scales into classical compositions as inappropriate and artistically inferior, something snapped inside the young musician. Miles stood up in front of the entire class and said words that would become legendary. "Professor, with all due respect, you can't teach me anything I need to know. The real music is happening in Harlem, not in this classroom." What followed was the most shocking dropout in music education history, a decision that would prove that sometimes the greatest artists must choose between institutional approval and artistic authenticity. Miles Davis walked away from the most prestigious music education in the world to learn from Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie on the streets of Harlem, a choice that would revolutionize jazz and prove that real musical education happens not in classrooms, but in the clubs, sessions, and collaborative discoveries where artists push each other to explore territories that no curriculum could ever map. This is the story of how a teenager's refusal to accept conventional musical wisdom became the foundation for one of the most innovative careers in music history. It was October 15th, 1944, and 18-year-old Miles Davis was experiencing the growing tension between what he was being taught and what he intuitively knew he needed to learn. He had arrived at Juilliard that September with high hopes and the financial sacrifice of his family, who had seen his acceptance to the prestigious school as validation of his musical talent and the key to a respectable career. Miles's father, Dr. Miles Davis II, had made significant financial sacrifices to send his son to New York. As a successful dentist in East St. Louis, he understood the value of formal education and believed that Juilliard would provide Miles with the technical foundation and cultural credibility necessary for a successful musical career. But from his first weeks at Juilliard, Miles felt a disconnect between the school's curriculum and the musical revolution he knew was happening in New York's jazz scene. While his professors lectured about European classical traditions and proper compositional techniques, Miles spent his evenings exploring the clubs of Harlem and 52nd Street, where he heard musicians like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk creating music that was infinitely more complex and innovative than anything discussed in his classes. The specific confrontation that would define Miles's relationship with institutional music education occurred in Dr. William Vacchiano's advanced music theory class. Dr. Vacchiano was a respected trumpet player with the New York Philharmonic and a longtime faculty member who prided himself on his rigorous approach to musical education and his commitment to classical tradition. That October afternoon, Dr. Vacchiano was discussing harmonic progressions in European classical music, specifically the proper resolution of dominant seventh chords, according to traditional voice-leading principles. He was explaining why certain chord progressions were considered correct and others were deemed inappropriate or unmusical. Miles raised his hand and asked a question that revealed the fundamental disconnect between his interests and the school's approach. "Professor, what about the harmonic progressions that Charlie Parker uses in his bebop improvisations? They violate traditional voice-leading rules, but they create incredible musical effects. Shouldn't we study those techniques as well?" Dr. Vacchiano's response was dismissive and condescending. Mr. Davis, jazz music, while entertaining, lacks the sophistication and structural integrity of classical composition. The techniques you're referring to are simplified versions of classical harmonic concepts, not innovations worthy of serious academic study. This response ignited something in Miles that had been building since his arrival at Juilliard. He was being told that the most exciting and innovative music he had ever heard was somehow inferior to compositions written centuries earlier by European composers who had never experienced American musical culture. "With respect, Professor," Miles replied, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made everyone in the classroom pay attention. "I think you're wrong. Charlie Parker understands harmony in ways that go far beyond what's in our textbooks. He's creating new harmonic possibilities that I've never heard in any classical piece." Dr. Vacchiano was not accustomed to being challenged by students, particularly first-year students, who presumed to lecture him about musical sophistication. "Mr. Davis, you're confusing novelty with innovation. True musical innovation requires years of study and mastery of traditional techniques. Jazz musicians are simply playing simplified versions of classical concepts without understanding the theoretical foundations that make those concepts meaningful." This was the moment that Miles would later describe as the turning point in his musical education. He realized that he was being taught by people who fundamentally misunderstood the music that inspired him most, and who were asking him to accept their limitations as absolute truths. Miles stood up from his seat, a gesture that immediately commanded the attention of every student and made Dr. Vacchiano pause in his lecture. The classroom fell silent as Miles gathered his books and music sheets. "Professor Vacchiano," Miles said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "I appreciate everything you're trying to teach me, but I have to be honest with you. You can't teach me anything I need to know. The real musical education is happening 20 blocks from here, in clubs where musicians are creating something completely new every night. That's where I need to be." The classroom was stunned. No one had ever heard a student speak to a professor with such directness, particularly a first-year student challenging a faculty member with decades of experience and institutional authority. Dr. Vacchiano was speechless for several seconds, struggling to process what had just happened. When he found his voice, his response was predictably institutional. "Mr. Davis, you're making a serious mistake. You're throwing away an opportunity that thousands of musicians would give anything to have. Without formal training and institutional credentials, you'll never be taken seriously in the classical music world." Miles's response would become legendary among jazz musicians. "Professor, I'm not trying to be taken seriously in the classical music world. I'm trying to create music that matters to people who are living right now, not music that impresses people who are stuck in the past." With that statement, Miles walked out of the classroom, effectively ending his formal relationship with Juilliard after just 6 weeks of classes. The immediate aftermath of this confrontation was complicated and painful for Miles. He had to call his father and explain why he was abandoning the educational opportunity that Dr. Davis had worked so hard to provide. The conversation was difficult, with his father initially angry and disappointed by what he saw as his son's impulsive and disrespectful behavior. But Miles was able to articulate a vision for his musical education that went beyond institutional validation. He explained to his father that he was learning more in a week of playing with experienced jazz musicians than he had learned in 6 weeks of traditional classroom instruction. "Dad," Miles said during their phone conversation, "I'm not dropping out of education. I'm dropping out of school to get a real education. Charlie Parker is teaching me things about music that no professor could ever understand." Dr. Davis, while still concerned about his son's decision, began to understand that Miles was following a different kind of educational path, one that prioritized practical experience and artistic development over institutional credentials. Miles's decision to leave Juilliard was vindicated almost immediately. Within weeks of dropping out, he was playing regularly with some of the most innovative musicians in New York. Charlie Parker, the saxophonist whose musical innovations had inspired Miles's confrontation with Professor Vacchiano, became his primary musical mentor. The education that Miles received from Parker and other jazz musicians was infinitely more valuable than anything he could have learned in a classroom. He learned to improvise at the highest level, to respond musically to unexpected developments, and to think about harmony, rhythm, and melody in completely new ways. Parker taught Miles that musical rules were meant to be understood and then transcended, while Professor Vacchiano had presented harmonic principles as absolute laws that must be followed. Parker showed Miles how those same principles could be used as starting points for creative exploration. Learn the rules so you can break them intelligently, Parker told Miles during one of their early sessions. This philosophy became central to Miles's approach to music throughout his entire career. The contrast between institutional and experiential learning became increasingly apparent as Miles developed his musical voice. In traditional music education, students were expected to master established techniques and reproduce them accurately. In the jazz scene, musicians were expected to understand traditional techniques well enough to build upon them and create something entirely new. Miles's experience at Juilliard also taught him something important about the relationship between formal education and creative innovation. While institutional education could provide technical skills and historical knowledge, it often discouraged the kind of risk-taking and boundary-pushing that was essential to artistic development. The irony of Miles's Juilliard experience was that the school's emphasis on traditional European musical values actually strengthened his commitment to exploring American musical innovations. By clearly articulating what he was rejecting, Professor Vacchiano had helped Miles clarify what he was seeking. Years later, when Miles became one of the most celebrated musicians in the world, he would often reflect on his brief time at Juilliard with a mixture of appreciation and vindication. He appreciated the technical skills he had learned during his short time there, but he was vindicated in his belief that the most important musical education happened outside traditional institutional frameworks. The confrontation with Professor Vacchiano also established a pattern that would characterize Miles's entire career: his willingness to challenge authority figures who tried to limit his artistic exploration. Throughout his life, Miles would clash with record executives, critics, and other musicians who attempted to define what his music should sound like or how he should present himself as an artist. The story of Miles's dropout from Juilliard became legendary among jazz musicians as an example of artistic courage and the importance of following one's creative instincts, even when they conflicted with conventional wisdom or institutional expectations. Many musicians who heard this story were inspired to trust their own artistic judgment over the approval of teachers, critics, or industry professionals who might not understand their creative vision. The educational philosophy that emerged from Miles's experience emphasized the importance of learning from practitioners rather than theorists, of prioritizing creative development over institutional validation, and of understanding that the most important musical lessons often happen in collaborative, real-world contexts rather than in classrooms. Miles's decision to leave Juilliard also demonstrated the importance of recognizing when an educational environment is no longer serving your development. Rather than passively accepting instruction that felt irrelevant or limiting, Miles took responsibility for his own education and sought out the learning experiences that would actually advance his artistic goals. The long-term impact of Miles's dropout extended far beyond his personal career. His success proved that musicians could achieve the highest levels of artistic and commercial success without traditional institutional credentials, inspiring countless other artists to pursue non-traditional educational paths. Music schools eventually began to incorporate more jazz and contemporary music into their curricula, partly in response to the recognition that their traditional approaches were not serving students who were interested in America's most important musical innovations. The story also highlighted the cultural tensions between European classical traditions and American musical innovations. Miles's confrontation with Professor Vacchiano was not just about individual educational preferences, but about larger questions of cultural value and artistic legitimacy. By walking away from Juilliard to study with Charlie Parker, Miles was making a statement about where he believed the most important musical developments were occurring and whose artistic judgment he trusted most. The courage required for this decision cannot be overstated. Miles was an 18-year-old African-American student from the Midwest, challenging the authority of one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the country, and abandoning the security that formal credentials might have provided. His willingness to take this risk, to trust his own artistic instincts over institutional authority, became a defining characteristic of his approach to music and life. Throughout his career, Miles would continue to make choices that prioritized artistic authenticity over safety, innovation over acceptance, and creative growth over commercial predictability. The shocking truth about Miles's Juilliard experience was that his confrontation with Professor Vacchiano was not an act of rebellion or disrespect, but rather an act of clarity and courage. He understood what he needed to learn and where he needed to learn it, and he was willing to sacrifice institutional approval to pursue the education that would actually serve his artistic development. This decision proved that sometimes the greatest act of respect for music itself is the willingness to challenge those who claim to be its guardians, but who actually limit its possibilities through their narrow understanding of what music can and should be. The broader implications of Miles's educational philosophy became apparent throughout his career, as he consistently chose artistic authenticity over institutional approval. His willingness to abandon Juilliard established a pattern of decision-making that would characterize his entire artistic life. The cultural significance of Miles' dropout extended beyond individual artistic development to larger questions about American musical identity. His rejection of Juilliard's Eurocentric curriculum was also a rejection of the cultural hierarchy that positioned European classical music as inherently superior to American musical innovations. This cultural challenge was particularly significant coming from a young African-American musician in 1944. By choosing to learn from Charlie Parker and other Black innovators rather than from traditional European-trained instructors, Miles was making a statement about cultural value and artistic authority. The pedagogical methods that Miles encountered at Juilliard were based on imitation and reproduction rather than innovation and creation. Students were expected to master existing repertoire and techniques, not to develop new artistic approaches. This educational approach was fundamentally incompatible with Miles's artistic temperament. He was already thinking like an innovator, someone who wanted to expand musical possibilities rather than simply preserve traditional practices. The jazz education that Miles received from Charlie Parker emphasized listening, responding, and building upon musical ideas in real time. Students were expected to contribute creatively to musical situations rather than simply executing predetermined parts. This approach developed the creative confidence and musical intuition that characterized Miles's playing. The economic implications of Miles's educational choice were significant. By leaving Juilliard, he was abandoning potential career security that formal credentials might have provided. However, Miles's success proved that artistic excellence could be achieved through non-traditional educational paths. The influence of Miles's educational philosophy extended to subsequent generations of musicians who were inspired to prioritize artistic development over institutional approval. Many successful jazz musicians followed similar paths, learning primarily through performance experience and mentorship. This trend contributed to alternative educational approaches in jazz and contemporary music. Community-based music programs, mentorship networks, and performance-oriented learning environments became increasingly common as alternatives to traditional conservatory education. The relationship between traditional music education and innovation became a central debate within American musical culture, with Miles's story serving as a powerful example of how formal educational constraints could actually inhibit creative development. Music educators began recognizing that their curricula needed to incorporate more flexibility and emphasis on creative exploration if they wanted to serve students interested in developing as innovative artists rather than just skilled technicians. The generational aspects of Miles's confrontation with Professor Vacchiano also reflected broader cultural changes occurring in American society during the 1940s. Young people were increasingly questioning traditional authorities, seeking educational paths that reflected their own values rather than simply accepting inherited structures. Miles's willingness to challenge Professor Vacchiano represented this broader generational shift toward greater individual agency and skepticism about institutional authority. His decision to leave Juilliard was part of a larger cultural movement that would transform American education and social relationships. The racial dynamics of Miles's educational experience were complex and significant. As one of the few African-American students at Juilliard in 1944, he was navigating not only artistic challenges, but also racial barriers that affected how his contributions were received. Professor Vacchiano's dismissive attitude toward jazz reflected broader cultural prejudices that devalued African-American musical innovations. By defending jazz's sophistication, Miles was defending his community's cultural contributions against institutional discrimination. The artistic validation that Miles found in the Harlem jazz scene provided him with confidence and support lacking in his Juilliard experience. Working with established musicians like Charlie Parker gave him access to a community who shared his values and understood his creative goals. This sense of artistic community became a crucial element of Miles's continued development. The mentorship and collaborative relationships he formed provided not only technical instruction, but also creative encouragement that institutional education had failed to provide. The long-term impact of Miles's educational choice was vindicated by his subsequent career achievements. His innovations in cool jazz, hard bop, modal jazz, and fusion proved that his educational path was far more effective than traditional institutional training. The recognition that Miles eventually received, including honorary doctorates from prestigious universities, represented cultural acknowledgement that his educational choices had been artistically valid, even though initially seen as rebellious. The contemporary relevance of Miles's educational philosophy continues to influence discussions about creativity and innovation. His emphasis on experiential learning and mentorship has been adopted by educational programs in business, technology, and the arts. The entrepreneurial aspects of Miles's educational approach also proved prophetic. By taking responsibility for his own learning and seeking experiences that would serve his goals, he demonstrated self-directed career development that would become increasingly important in creative industries. The story of Miles's confrontation with Professor Vacchiano has become a cautionary tale for educators who might be limiting students' creative potential through rigid adherence to traditional curricula or cultural biases against contemporary artistic innovations. Educational institutions have gradually recognized the importance of incorporating diverse musical traditions and contemporary creative practices into their programs, partly in response to recognition that traditional approaches were not adequately serving students with innovative artistic aspirations. The courage that Miles demonstrated in challenging institutional authority and following his artistic instincts became a model for creative individuals who faced conflicts between personal vision and external expectations. His story continues to inspire artists, entrepreneurs and innovators who must choose between conventional security and the uncertainty but potential rewards of following their creative intuition. If this story of educational courage, the importance of following artistic instincts, and how sometimes the greatest learning happens outside traditional institutions moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with any artist who has ever felt constrained by traditional educational approaches. Any student who has questioned whether formal education serves their creative goals, or anyone who needs to understand that true artistic development often requires courage to choose authenticity over approval. Have you ever had to choose between institutional validation and following your creative instincts? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about artistic courage and trusting your own creative vision when conventional wisdom completely fails.